20 Crazy. 1960s. Things that were once normal. Smoking on planes, no seatbelts, and kids playing with molten lead. Welcome to the 1960s. It was a time when danger was ignored, rules were loose, and somehow, people survived. From bizarre beauty trends to toxic toys, everyday life was wilder than you remember. Let's dive into the strangest things that were once completely normal. Hair. Back in the 1960s, hair care wasn't just a routine, it was practically a full-time job. Women went to great lengths to achieve the decade's most fashionable hairstyles, and those styles required serious commitment. The beehive, bouffant, and other voluminous looks didn't just happen naturally. They took hours of backcombing, teasing, and layering on thick coats of hairspray to hold everything in place. It wasn't just a spritz here and there. Women used so much hairspray that by the end of the day, their hair was practically a solid structure. And since aerosol sprays back then were loaded with chemicals, it's no wonder people joked that they were practically shellacking their heads. Of course, just like today, women with straight hair wanted curls, and women with curls wanted sleek, straight locks. But unlike today's modern flat irons, 1960s women had to get creative. Instead of plugging in a straightener, many resorted to the old-school method, literally ironing their hair. They'd lay their locks across an ironing board and have a friend, sister, or even their mom press it flat with a scorching hot clothing iron. Can you imagine how many singed ends, burnt scalps, and smoky disasters came from that? It was beauty at any cost. And for some, that cost was a few fried strands. Breakfast hack. Breakfast in the 1960s wasn't just about nutrition. It was about finding ways to make it exciting, especially for kids. A plain bowl of oatmeal or cream of wheat, that just didn't cut it. Sure, it was warm, filling, and packed with nutrients. But let's be honest, on its own, it wasn't exactly the most thrilling way to start the day. So, families got creative. Instead of just adding sugar or fruit, some households took breakfast to the next level by adding a scoop of ice cream right on top. That's right, hot cereal with a cold, creamy twist. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry. Whatever flavor was in the freezer could instantly transform an ordinary bowl of mush into a morning treat. As the ice cream melted, it blended into the cereal, making it richer, sweeter, and a whole lot more tempting for picky eaters. Parents probably convinced themselves it was a sneaky way to get kids to eat a nutritious breakfast. And honestly, who could argue? After all, ice cream has a way of making everything better. It might not have been the healthiest choice, but back then, it was just another way to start the day with a little extra joy. Shaving before disposables. Before disposable razors hit the shelves in 1974, shaving was a whole different experience. Men, and women, relied on what we now call old-fashioned safety razors, a step up from the straight razors used by barbers. These metal razors featured a protective guard to reduce the risk of nasty cuts and nicks, but they still required a steady hand and some skill to use properly. If you've ever seen one, they almost resemble a small paint scraper. But don't let the look fool you. These razors were durable, well-crafted, and got the job done effectively. Then came the 1970s, and everything changed. Companies like Bic and Gillette revolutionized the shaving industry with the idea of disposable razors, cheap, convenient, and meant to be tossed after a few uses. Suddenly, shaving wasn't just about getting a close cut. It was about buying into a never-ending cycle of replacements. People quickly embraced the ease of disposables, and the old-school safety razors started to fade into history. Jell-O. Jell-O has been a classic dessert for generations, but in the 1960s, it wasn't just about sweet, fruity flavors like cherry, lime, or strawberry. No, things took a strange turn. one that modern taste buds might find downright shocking. In an attempt to expand its appeal, the Jell-O brand introduced savory flavors like celery, mixed vegetable, and even tomato. These weren't meant to be desserts. They were designed for salads and side dishes, often molded into elaborate shapes and packed with everything from olives to shredded cabbage. Cookbooks of the era fully embraced this gelatin craze, dedicating entire sections to bizarre recipes that turned Jell-O into something questionable. Imagine sitting down to dinner and being served a wobbly, translucent creation filled with tuna, hard-boiled eggs, or chunks of ham. Yes, this was considered cutting-edge cuisine. Thankfully, these savory gelatin experiments have mostly faded into history. At least, we hope they have. Creepy crawlers. If you were a kid in the 1960s, there was one toy that topped every wish list: the Thingmaker, also known as creepy crawlers. If you didn't have one, you definitely wanted one. It was every child's dream. The power to create your own tiny rubbery bugs, snakes, and other creepy critters. But here's the catch. This wasn't just some simple craft set. It came with a plug-in hot plate and metal molds that reached scorching temperatures. Kids would squeeze a colorful, chemical-laden goop into the molds, then heat them up until they solidified into little rubber creatures. Sounds perfectly safe, right? Of course, there were plenty of opportunities for disaster. Burning yourself was practically a rite of passage. Kids quickly learned the hard way: touch the hot metal, and you'd get an instant lesson in pain. But even if you managed to avoid burns, you couldn't escape the overwhelming fumes. The smell of melting plastic was unforgettable. Once you inhaled it, it was burned into your memory forever. Back then, though, no one questioned it. Parents weren't worried about chemicals or safety standards. They were just glad their kids were entertained. Today, creepy crawlers exist in a much safer, reimagined form. But those who grew up in the 60s still remember the original. Dangerous, smelly, and absolutely awesome. Lead. If you lived in the 1960s, chances are you came into contact with lead paint. And not just a little bit. Whether you were painting a room, brushing up against a freshly painted wall, or just living in a house built before the 1970s, lead was everywhere. It was a key ingredient in paint because it made colors brighter, helped the paint dry faster, and made it more resistant to moisture. At the time, no one thought twice about it. The health risks? Not even a discussion. It wasn't just paint, though. Lead was practically a household staple. You could walk into a store and buy lead bars, melt them down in your own backyard, and cast homemade fishing weights. Even more shockingly, kids were given kits to create their own toy soldiers out of molten lead. That's right. Children would pour liquid metal into molds, wait for it to harden, then paint their tiny soldiers with, you guessed it, more lead-based paint. The government finally banned lead in residential paint in 1978, but for anyone who grew up in the 60s, it's amazing they made it through without glowing in the dark. Which 1960s habit or trend shocks you the most when you look back on it now? Chemistry sets. Back in the 1960s, kids weren't just playing with toys, they were dabbling in real chemistry. The Gilbert chemistry set was one of the most popular gifts a kid could receive, promising hours of hands-on fun. But unlike today's watered-down science kits, these sets came with actual chemicals, some of them highly flammable and potentially explosive. Substances like potassium permanganate and ammonium nitrate were just part of the mix. And while a single kit wouldn't blow up an entire house, a determined kid with a curious mind could certainly create a few fiery surprises. At the time, though, no one really worried about safety. In fact, these kits were already considered safer than earlier versions. After all, the radioactive uranium samples had been removed in 1952. Parents saw chemistry sets as educational, a way to inspire young scientists, not a potential fire hazard. But as attitudes toward child safety changed, so did chemistry sets. By the late 1960s, the A.C. Gilbert Company shut down, and by 1984, Porter Chemical Company, another big name in the chemistry kit business, also went out of business. Asbestos. In the 1960s, asbestos was everywhere, and no one thought twice about it. It was a common building material found in insulation, floor tiles, walls, and even pipes. It was durable, fire-resistant, and considered a miracle product for home construction. But what people didn't know at the time was that asbestos exposure could lead to serious health problems, including lung disease and cancer. By the time it was officially recognized as a major health hazard, countless homes and businesses had already been filled with it. Even more shocking, kids may have unknowingly played with loose asbestos. One of the most unbelievable uses of this toxic material was fake snow. That's right, the fluffy, white artificial snow used in Christmas decorations and even Hollywood films like White Christmas was made from pure asbestos fibers. It was marketed as the perfect fireproof way to create a winter wonderland, completely safe, or so people thought. For years, families spread asbestos snow around their homes, draping it over Christmas trees, mantels, and holiday displays, completely unaware of the dangers. Hockey. If you ever watch old hockey footage from the 1960s, one thing stands out almost immediately. Nobody was wearing a helmet. That's right, players were skating at high speeds, crashing into each other, and taking blistering slap shots to the head with zero protection. These were some of the toughest athletes in sports history, and somehow, they seemed to shake off injuries that today would land a player in concussion protocol. Apparently, brain damage wasn't a concern, at least not back then. The NHL didn't start requiring helmets until 1979, and even then, the rule only applied to new players entering the league. If you had already been playing before the mandate, you could choose to keep going without one, and many did. In fact, the last helmetless player, Craig McTavish, didn't retire until 1997. That means for nearly 2 more decades, you still had guys out there skating around bareheaded, defying both logic and modern safety standards. Fat-shaking craze. Exercise takes effort, and let's be honest, not everyone is eager to break a sweat. But just because people weren't hitting the gym didn't mean they weren't looking for shortcuts to weight loss. And in the 1960s, one of the most popular solutions was the vibrating belt machine. The idea was simple. Strap yourself in, let the machine jiggle your fat, and watch the pounds melt away. Advertisements promised effortless weight loss, claiming that the intense vibrations would break down fat cells and magically slim your waistline. No dieting, no cardio, just stand there and let the machine do all the work. Sounds too good to be true? Well, it was. Despite their popularity, these machines did absolutely nothing to burn fat. Sure, they made people look utterly ridiculous as they jiggled away in their living rooms or at beauty salons, but by the 1980s, the truth caught up. People finally realized that shaking the fat didn't make it disappear, and the vibrating belt machine went the way of other fitness fads. Drunk driving. In the 1960s, drunk driving wasn't seen as the serious crime it is today. It was more of a reckless rite of passage, especially for young men. Laws were on the books, but enforcement? Practically non-existent. Even if someone got caught, they could often request a jury trial, where they'd almost always be acquitted. Juries tended to be sympathetic, viewing it as just another youthful mistake rather than a life-threatening danger. During this decade, many states began setting blood alcohol limits at 0.1 or even 0.12, But these laws were more of a formality than a deterrent. The reality was that most people didn't take drunk driving seriously. Cops would often just give offenders a warning or even a ride home. The culture was so relaxed that having a few drinks before getting behind the wheel wasn't just accepted, it was almost expected. Everything changed in the 1980s, when public outrage finally reached a tipping point. Organizations like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADI, launched aggressive campaigns to shift public perception and push for stricter laws and real enforcement. The days of casually driving home after a night of heavy drinking were over. Today, it's hard to believe that there was ever a time when drunk driving was seen as just one of those things. But in the 1960s, that's exactly how it was. What's something from the 1960s that you actually miss and wish would make a comeback? Old enough for war, but not for a beer. If you were a young man in the 1960s, there was a very real chance that you were going to be drafted into the military, unless you had a medical condition or some other exemption. By the late 60s, the Vietnam War had escalated, and thousands of 18-year-olds were being sent overseas to fight in a war they had no say in. That was the strange reality. You were old enough to go to war and die for your country, but not old enough to vote for the leaders sending you there. At the time, the voting age was 21, which had been the standard for decades. The drinking age was also set at 21 in most states, largely because it had been tied to the legal voting age since the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. But as the Vietnam War raged on, public outcry over this contradiction grew louder. If 18-year-olds could be drafted, shouldn't they also have the right to vote? This led to the 26th Amendment in 1971, which officially lowered the voting age to 18. Some states responded by lowering the drinking age to 18, starting in 1972, but others weren't as quick to follow. By the late 1970s, concerns about drunk driving led many states to raise the drinking age again, first to 19 and later back to 21. The final nationwide shift came in 1984, when Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, forcing states to raise the drinking age to 21 or lose 10% of their federal highway funding. By 1988, all 50 states had fallen in line. Skateboarding. Skateboarding may be a massive sport today, but its origins trace back to the late 1940s and early 1950s, when surfers in California wanted a way to surf the streets when the ocean waves weren't cooperating. At first, their boards were little more than pieces of plywood with roller skate wheels slapped on the bottom, a crude but effective way to replicate the thrill of surfing on dry land. By the 1960s, skateboarding had started gaining real traction. Surf companies began producing professionally designed skateboards, often shaped like miniature surfboards. The growing popularity led to the first televised skateboarding competition in 1965, which aired on ABC's Wide World of Sports. Around this time, one of the sport's first breakout stars emerged, Patty McGee, one of the earliest sponsored skateboarders. She traveled across the country, giving demonstrations and promoting safety tips, and even landed on the cover of Life magazine. Her television appearances, including a spot on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, helped push skateboarding into the mainstream. Incredible edibles. In the late 1960s, Mattel introduced a toy that let kids play with their food, literally. Incredible Edibles, sold from 1967 to 1968, was a spin-off of the popular Creepy Crawlers thingmaker. Except this time, instead of just making rubbery bugs, you could eat them. The process was simple but wildly entertaining for kids. You'd squirt a gelatin-based gel, charmingly named Gobble the Goop, into a circular mold, pop it into the included heating unit, and after a few minutes, out came a chewy, rubbery, candy shaped like worms, insects, and flowers. The goop came in an assortment of flavors, making it a fun, interactive snack. However, The problem was that it looked a lot like the plastic goop used in the thing maker, which was most definitely not edible. If you had a younger sibling who wasn't paying close attention, well, let's just say there were probably some unfortunate taste tests. Despite its short run, Incredible Edibles was a hit, capturing the excitement of hands-on candy making before it faded into toy history. While modern edible toy kits exist today, few can match the sheer 1960s charm of baking your own wiggly, gelatinous bugs and then eating them, hopefully without mixing up the wrong goop. Smoking everywhere. Looking back, it's almost hard to believe just how normal smoking was in the 1960s. There were no restrictions, no secondhand smoke warnings, and definitely no designated smoking areas. People lit up anywhere and everywhere, inside restaurants, in office buildings, at the movie theater, and even inside hospitals and doctors' offices. Yes, you read that right. Some dentists would actually smoke while working on a patient's teeth. Imagine sitting in the chair, getting a filling, while your dentist casually takes a drag in between drilling. Because the health risks of smoking weren't widely publicized, no one really questioned it. In fact, cigarettes were so ingrained in daily life that you'd see parents smoking around their children, and no one batted an eye. It wasn't until decades later, when medical studies finally made the dangers of secondhand smoke common knowledge, that public perception started to change. The first real step was the introduction of non-smoking sections in restaurants, which at the time felt like a big compromise. But by the late 1980s and 1990s, smoking bans became more widespread, slowly erasing smoker-friendly spaces from public life. No seatbelts in cars. It's almost unthinkable today, but back in the 1960s, seatbelts weren't just optional. Many cars didn't even come with them. Automakers weren't required to install seatbelts, and most people didn't think twice about driving without any kind of safety restraint. The idea of crash safety research wasn't as widespread, and while car accidents were just as dangerous back then as they are now, the culture around driving was far more relaxed. Most people who grew up in that era have memories of piling into a friend's car with no seatbelts in sight, no one worrying about safety, just squeezing in as many people as possible. Kids rode on their parents' laps, crawled around the back seat, and if you had a station wagon, it was practically a rolling jungle gym. And child car seats? Forget it. If they existed at all, they were more about giving a kid a better view than actually protecting them in a crash. It wasn't until 1968 that U.S. law required car manufacturers to install seatbelts in all new vehicles. Even then, it took years before people actually started wearing them. In fact, seatbelt laws weren't enforced on a national scale until the 1980s. Looking back, it's shocking how casual people were about car safety. But in the 1960s, seatbelts were more of a suggestion than a necessity. What's the craziest thing you remember doing in the 1960s that would be unthinkable today? Gender-specific job ads. If you flipped through the Help Wanted section of a newspaper in the 1960s, you'd see something that would be completely unacceptable today: gender-specific job listings. Employers didn't just imply which jobs were for men and which were for women. They explicitly stated it in the ad. There were separate sections: Help Wanted, Male, and Help Wanted, Female. The expectations were clear. Women were encouraged to apply for secretarial, clerical, teaching, or nursing positions, while men were funneled into leadership, management, and technical jobs. It wasn't just social pressure. This was a legally accepted hiring practice. Women looking to break into male-dominated fields were often discouraged or outright denied opportunities, reinforcing the idea that some jobs were simply not for them. It wasn't until 1968 that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, finally ruled that gender-segregated job ads violated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Even so, Change didn't happen overnight. It took years of legal battles and cultural shifts before women were given equal access to a wider range of careers. Casual littering. Believe it or not, casual littering was just a normal part of life in the 1960s. People thought nothing of tossing soda cans, cigarette butts, and fast food wrappers right onto the sidewalk, into parks, or even out of their car windows while driving down the highway. The idea of responsibly disposing of trash just wasn't drilled into people's minds the way it is today. It wasn't until the 1970s that a real cultural shift took place. Environmental awareness movements began to wake people up to the damage littering was causing, and public service campaigns like Keep America Beautiful started cracking down on these bad habits. The famous Crying Indian commercial in 1971, featuring a Native American man shedding a tear as he watched people pollute the land, became a powerful moment in advertising history. Fast forward to today, and littering is not just frowned upon, it's illegal. Many states impose hefty fines for littering, and in some places, repeat offenders can face community service or even harsher penalties. Thankfully, society has come a long way since the days when people treated the great outdoors like their personal trash can. But in the 1960s, if you went to a park after a picnic, you'd likely find the leftovers still sitting there long after the people were gone. Polio scare and iron lungs. If you were a child in the 1950s or early 1960s, the fear of polio was very real. Parents lived in constant worry because the virus primarily affected children, often leading to paralysis or even death. It wasn't just an abstract threat. You likely knew someone who had been affected. Hospitals were filled with massive, coffin-like machines called iron lungs, which acted as primitive ventilators for polio victims whose muscles had been paralyzed by the disease. Before the polio vaccine became widespread, contracting the virus meant the possibility of spending weeks, months, or even a lifetime confined inside an iron lung just to breathe. The sight of these machines, lined up in hospital wards, was enough to strike fear into any parent's heart. Public pools, playgrounds, and crowded events were often avoided during outbreaks, as no one knew exactly how the disease spread. Everything changed when Dr. Jonas Salk developed the first polio vaccine in 1955. By the early 1960s, millions of children were receiving the oral polio vaccine on a sugar cube, a moment many still remember. The once dreaded disease began to disappear, and by the late 20th century, polio was nearly eradicated in the U.S. Using mercury thermometers. Back in the 1960s, and for decades after, mercury thermometers were a household staple. If you had a fever, your mom or grandma would grab one from the medicine cabinet, give it a quick shake to wake up the mercury, and pop it under your tongue. Simple, effective, and completely normal, except for one small problem. Mercury is highly toxic. At the time, no one thought much about the dangers of handling liquid mercury. If you accidentally dropped the thermometer and it shattered, you didn't panic. You just watched in fascination as the tiny silver beads of mercury rolled across the floor. Some kids even played with it, pushing the glistening droplets around with their fingers. Yikes. It wasn't until later that health experts raised concerns about mercury exposure, especially from inhaling vapors released when a thermometer broke. By the early 2000s, mercury thermometers were largely phased out, replaced by safer digital and alcohol-based versions. Doctors endorsing cigarettes. It's almost unbelievable today, but there was a time when doctors themselves were featured in cigarette ads, smiling in their white coats while recommending one brand over another. In the 1950s and 1960s, cigarette companies used medical authority to make smoking seem safe, if not downright beneficial. Ads proudly proclaimed that more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette, swinging as if that somehow made them a healthier choice. To be fair, We'd like to think that many doctors truly didn't understand the full extent of the dangers of smoking at the time. After all, smoking was everywhere, in homes, offices, airplanes, and even hospitals. Many medical professionals were smokers themselves, just like the rest of the population. However, there's no denying that big tobacco had a heavy hand in shaping public perception. Cigarette companies paid for industry-backed studies to downplay the risks, and doctors who appeared in the ads likely weren't doing it out of pure medical research, but rather a well-padded paycheck. The golden age of flying. A fascinating look at the 1950s and 60s. Flying in the 1950s and 60s was pure luxury. Elegant hostesses, gourmet meals, and lounges in the sky. But behind the glamour were risks, turbulence, and even hijackings. How did we go from golden age elegance to today's packed cabins? Let's take off and find out. A first-class experience. Let's step back in time, straighten our ties, and take a journey into the golden age of air travel. Picture this. It's 1958, and we've just arrived at the airport terminal, where everything feels sleek, stylish, and oh so sophisticated. The air is filled with excitement, and the passengers? They're dressed to impress. Flying isn't just about getting from point A to point B. It's an event, a moment to savor. Back then, airlines didn't just sell tickets, they sold an experience. Much like luxury cruise liners, they promised elegance and exclusivity. Flight attendants in crisp uniforms welcomed travelers aboard gleaming aircraft, where plush seats and gourmet meals awaited. For many, this was their very first time taking to the skies, and the thrill was undeniable. Nothing quite compares to stepping onto a plane for the first time, the advertisements boasted. One look at this magnificent interior, and you know you're about to experience the high life. The polished metal fuselage, the rich leather seats, the attentive service, every detail made passengers feel like royalty. This wasn't just transportation, it was an adventure, wrapped in glamour, served with a side of champagne. Luxury in the skies. Cleared for takeoff. The pilot's voice crackles over the radio as the engines roar to life. Within moments, we lift gracefully into the sky, and suddenly, we're floating among the clouds in the lap of luxury. In the 1950s, flying wasn't just a way to travel. It was an elite experience, a symbol of status and sophistication. Passengers settled into their spacious seats, enjoying an atmosphere that felt more like a five-star hotel than an aircraft. Time flies quickly when one is happy and comfortable. Advertisements promised, and airlines made sure to deliver. Dressed in their finest attire, passengers reclined in plush seats with generous legroom, sipping champagne as they gazed out at the world below. Dining at 30,000 feet was an experience in itself. The finest meals, from fresh lobster to filet mignon, were served on real china with silver cutlery. Some dinners lasted 2 to 3 hours, complete with unlimited drinks and impeccable service. This level of extravagance came at a price. Air travel was reserved for the wealthy, those who could afford to turn a journey into an indulgence. Flying wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about enjoying the ride in unparalleled style. The 1990s. The 1990s. The birth of a new era in air travel. Flying in the 1990s was a unique blend of comfort and cutting-edge technology. Airlines still prioritized passenger experience, offering complimentary alcoholic beverages on both domestic and international routes. This was also the decade when in-flight entertainment truly began to evolve. Overhead screens became a standard feature, playing movies for all passengers to enjoy. While travelers couldn't yet choose their own films, watching a Hollywood blockbuster at 35,000 feet was an exciting novelty. Another major innovation was the introduction of personal seatback telephones. Though costly to use, These phones gave passengers the rare opportunity to make a call while soaring above the clouds, an experience that felt futuristic at the time. While today's travelers enjoy personalized, on-demand entertainment and Wi-Fi, the 1990s laid the foundation for the modern in-flight experience. It was a time when air travel was still an event, and airlines competed to make flying feel special. Whether sipping a free drink, catching a film, or making a mid-air phone call, passengers in the 90s got a glimpse of the high-tech future that was just around the corner. The 2000s, a new era of air travel security. The 2000s saw a seismic shift in air travel, primarily due to the events of September 11, 2001. Before the attacks, airport security was far more relaxed. Passengers could bring liquids, pocket knives, and even loved ones to the gate. But after September 11th, everything changed. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, was established, leading to strict screenings, locked cockpit doors, and limited terminal access. Air travel became safer, but also more time-consuming, marking the beginning of a new security-focused era in aviation. Modern air travel. Convenience meets luxury for a price. Today's flights offer nearly all the comforts of home, touchscreen entertainment, USB chargers, and Wi-Fi at 30,000 feet. However, gone are the days of free meals and unlimited drinks in economy class. Airlines focus on cost efficiency, charging for extras that were once standard. For those willing to splurge, first class remains a world of luxury, with fully reclining seats, gourmet dining, and even private suites. While flying has never been more accessible, the experience now depends on how much you're willing to pay. If you could time travel to any decade just to experience air travel, which one would you choose and why? What you could do, then, that you can't do now. Now, let's talk about some things you could do on a plane back in the 1950s that are completely unheard of today. First up, smoking. That's right. Lighting up a cigarette at 30,000 feet was perfectly normal. In fact, ashtrays were built into every seat, and smoke-filled cabins were just part of the experience. It wasn't until the late 20th century that bans started rolling out, finally becoming universal in the 1990s. And in-flight entertainment? Forget seatback screens and Wi-Fi. Those didn't exist yet. Instead, passengers entertained themselves with books, magazines, or even a friendly game of chess with their seatmate. But one thing modern flights can't compete with? Sleeping in true comfort. Many planes had seats that transformed into full beds, allowing passengers to stretch out and sleep as if they were in a hotel room. Here I am, out over the Atlantic, and missing none of the comforts of home, travelers marveled. And honestly, with all that legroom, fine dining, and first-class service, who could blame them? The glamorous life of 1950s stewardesses. Now let's talk about the real stars of 1950s air travel, the stewardesses. These women weren't just flight attendants. They were the face of luxury in the skies. But before they ever stepped onto a plane, they had to earn their wings through rigorous training. It all started with the application process. "I've wanted to be a hostess since I was 18, a hopeful applicant might say as she submitted her paperwork, dreaming of adventure. But getting accepted was just the beginning. Once admitted to a prestigious airline training academy, the next few weeks were a whirlwind of instruction. Comportment classes taught them how to walk with grace, balance trays in turbulence, and maintain perfect posture, even during knee bends. And of course, makeup courses ensured they always looked flawless under any conditions. Before taking to the skies, they practiced in a mock airplane, dealing with all sorts of challenging passengers, including a pretend Mr. Tipsy who tested their patience. "No tipping," they'd remind him with a smile. Finally, after weeks of hard work, they received their coveted wings. So long, Mary. Keep 'em smiling. With that, a new adventure began, one filled with elegance, excitement, and the unmistakable charm of the golden age of aviation. Safety and luxury. In 1950s, aviation. Back in the 1950s and 60s, airlines had to do more than just sell a ticket. They had to convince people that flying was safe. At the time, air travel was much riskier than it is today, so the industry put a lot of effort into reassuring passengers. One of the slogans of the era went, "You can travel 21,184,000 miles before you can reasonably expect to be killed in an air accident." Not exactly a comforting thought, but it was an attempt to highlight just how rare accidents were, despite the inherent risks. Airlines also showed off their global reach with maps and displays, like the iconic Speedbird markers that dotted the globe, each representing an aircraft flying across the world. They wanted passengers to feel confident that aviation was on the rise and that planes were steadily becoming safer. Despite their efforts, flying in those days wasn't always the smooth, quiet experience we're used to now. Planes flew lower, which meant they were louder and often vibrated from turbulence. That said, there were still ways to pass the time. Newly designed lounges offered a spot to relax and unwind, often serving up drinks to calm the nerves of those brave enough to take to the skies. Flying may have been a bit bumpier back then, but the luxury and excitement of air travel still made it a thrilling experience. What's your favorite era of air travel? 1920s to 1930s, 1950s to 1960s, 1970s to 1980s, 90s to present. Please leave your answer in the comments below. The 1960s, the rise of air travel and the end of an era. The 1960s marked a turning point in commercial aviation. While flying was still a luxury, it became more accessible, and the experience remained far more comfortable than today. Passengers no longer dressed to the nines, but they still wore expensive suits and fine clothing. Airlines continued to offer gourmet meals, spacious seating, and a level of service that made flying feel like a special occasion. Security was virtually non-existent. There were no ID checks, and passengers could arrive just 30 minutes before departure, walk straight to the gate, and board their flight. Even family members could accompany them right up to the plane. However, this era of relaxed travel was coming to an end. By 1973, the first major security measures, like baggage screening and passenger identification, were introduced in response to rising hijackings. Despite these changes, the 1960s were still a golden age for aviation, with the introduction of international jet travel and airlines competing to provide the most luxurious experience possible. The 1970s, the era of the jumbo jet and affordable air travel. The 1970s revolutionized commercial aviation with the introduction of the Boeing 747, also known as the jumbo jet. This massive aircraft could carry more passengers than ever before, making air travel more accessible and affordable for millions who had previously been priced out. Airlines competed to attract travelers with unique in-flight experiences, and for a brief period, luxury still reigned. From 1970 to 1974, American Airlines even featured a piano lounge on some of its 747s, allowing passengers to relax with live music at 35,000 feet. However, the oil crisis of the mid-1970s forced airlines to cut costs, leading to the gradual disappearance of extravagant amenities like in-flight lounges and gourmet dining. While flying in the 1970s retained some of the glamour of previous decades, the era marked the beginning of mass air travel as we know it today. The 1980s, the last era of in-flight fun and freedom. The early 1980s brought a more relaxed and enjoyable flying experience. Passengers could still smoke on board, enjoy free meals, and even socialize in unique in-flight pubs. Continental Airlines installed onboard bars with round tables and swivel chairs, creating a lounge-like atmosphere at 30,000 feet. Visiting the cockpit was a common treat, with pilots welcoming passengers, especially children, who often received commemorative rings as souvenirs. However, this era of in-flight freedom wouldn't last forever, as increasing security concerns and airline deregulation gradually reshaped the flying experience. Building airline identity. How carriers set themselves apart in the 1950s. In the golden age of aviation, airlines weren't just selling tickets, they were selling an experience. But with so many carriers taking to the skies, how did they stand out? That was the challenge. One common complaint among travelers was that all airlines felt the same. May I be blunt? Flying in the USA, I find it difficult to tell one airline from another, one might say. To fix that, airlines began crafting distinct identities, using everything from cabin design to menu choices to set themselves apart. Want a taste of Europe? Some carriers specialized in regional cuisine, quiche Lorraine for the French touch, or classic fish and chips to evoke a British feel. Everything from the uniforms of the stewardesses to the type of champagne served was carefully selected to make flying a unique experience with each airline. These choices weren't just about food, they were about branding. Airlines wanted passengers to feel a connection, to develop loyalty. Whether it was the elegance of Pan Am, the bold personality of TWA, or the warm hospitality of American Airlines, each company worked to create its own signature style. The goal? To make sure passengers didn't just remember their journey, they remembered who took them there. When flying was effortless, air travel before security lines. Back in the 1950s and 60s, flying was a far simpler experience than it is today. There were no long security lines, no invasive screenings, and certainly no need to remove your shoes. Air travel had a sense of ease and glamour. Passengers simply arrived at the terminal, checked in, and walked straight onto the plane. Boarding was a smooth, almost elegant affair. Families could accompany loved ones right up to the gate, waving them off as they ascended the stairs to the aircraft. There were no X-ray machines, no metal detectors, just a ticket, a handshake from the flight attendant, and the thrill of stepping onto the aircraft. This relaxed approach, of course, came from a different era, before hijackings became a concern and before airlines had to prioritize security over convenience. The 1930s, the rise of comfort and service in air travel. The 1930s saw air travel transform from a rugged adventure into a more refined experience. One of the most notable changes was the introduction of female flight attendants, often referred to as stewardesses. These women were not just there for passenger comfort. They played a crucial role in ensuring safety, assisting with luggage, and providing a level of hospitality that helped ease nervous flyers. Aircraft design also made significant strides. Planes were now equipped with soundproofing, creating a quieter cabin environment. Temperature control systems made flights more comfortable, eliminating the freezing conditions of earlier years. Instead of stiff metal benches, passengers could now relax in upholstered seats. Some aircraft even offered seating options that resembled a lounge, with couches, folding chairs, and swivel seats for a more social flying experience. Technological improvements allowed planes to reach altitudes of around 20,000 feet, helping them avoid much of the turbulence that plagued lower altitude flights. Speeds also increased, with some aircraft cruising at nearly 200 miles per hour. Though air travel was still a luxury reserved for the wealthy, the 1930s laid the groundwork for the glamorous flying experience that would define the coming decades. Please comment 1. to let me know you'll be watching this video until the end. The 1940s. War transforms the future of air travel. The 1940s were a turning point for aviation, largely due to World War II. Aircraft technology advanced at an unprecedented rate, but during the war, nearly all planes were built for military use, not commercial travel. However, when the war ended in 1945, the aviation industry saw a rapid shift. The large air bases with long runways, originally designed for bombers and cargo planes, were repurposed for civilian flights. This led to the expansion of commercial aviation on a scale never seen before. One of the most significant developments was the construction of new airports near major cities to support the growing demand for air travel. London Heathrow, originally a Royal Air Force base, officially opened for civilian use in 1946, becoming a key hub for international flights. Across the Atlantic, major airports in the U.S. also expanded, paving the way for increased global connectivity. Perhaps the biggest change was the normalization of transatlantic flights. Before the war, flying across the ocean was rare, but by the late 1940s, it became a daily occurrence. Passengers could now board a flight in New York and land in London within hours. Something that had once been a dream was now an everyday reality. The 1950s, the golden age of air travel, at a price. The 1950s are often remembered as the golden age of air travel, but flying was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. A round-trip flight from Chicago to Phoenix cost the equivalent of over $1,100 today, while a one-way ticket from New York to Europe could set you back more than $3,000 in today's money. Airlines marketed flying as an exclusive, glamorous experience. Passengers dressed in their finest attire, with men in suits and women in elegant dresses. Once on board, they were treated to first-class service, complete with fine wine and gourmet meals. Forget plastic trays. Dining in the sky meant proper cutlery, glasses, and white tablecloths. Lobster, steak, and ribs were standard menu items, and meals could take up to 3 hours to serve. Spacious cabins, generous legroom, and plush seats made the journey feel more like a luxury cruise than modern air travel. However, while flying was stylish and comfortable, it wasn't as safe or efficient as it is today. Planes flew at lower altitudes, making turbulence a frequent issue, and airline crashes were far more common than they are now. But for those who could afford it, flying in the 1950s truly felt like traveling in style. The quirky side of airline advertising, selling the sky with style. By the 1960s and 70s, airlines weren't just promoting travel, they were selling an experience with flair, humor, and a touch of celebrity charm. Advertising became more playful, tapping into the era's sense of adventure and sophistication. Big names like Peter Sellers even appeared in commercials, bringing a touch of comedy to airline branding. TWA, for example, embraced this stylish approach with ads that made flying sound like a refined international affair. Wines of the world over Washington, continental cuisine over Colorado. It wasn't just a flight. It was a dining experience at 30,000 feet, paired with stunning aerial views. Airlines wanted passengers to feel like globetrotters from the moment they stepped on board. These quirky ads reflected the excitement of the jet age. Airlines weren't just competing on routes and ticket prices. They were vying for attention with charm and personality. Whether it was a celebrity endorsement, a catchy slogan, or an imaginative in-flight experience, the message was clear. Flying was no longer just transportation. It was a way to live well while traveling the world. The rise and fall of luxury, the 747 and the end of airline glamour. In 1969, the aviation world changed forever with the arrival of the Boeing 747, the first true jumbo jet. airlines were eager to showcase this marvel of engineering, promoting it with grand slogans like, "Your story, Assignment 747. Its sheer size allowed designers to create something never seen before, airborne luxury on an unprecedented scale. Passengers were enticed with first-class comforts. Remember what it was like before there was somebody else up there who loved you? With first-class legroom, free cocktails, and a dependable schedule. Airlines spared no expense, adding cocktail lounges, piano bars, and even spiral staircases to upper deck lounges. Flying wasn't just about reaching your destination, it was a social event in the sky. But this golden era of extravagance couldn't last forever. The early 1970s marked the last hurrah for airlines' lavish spending. Fierce competition led to bizarre marketing stunts to lure passengers. However, the oil crisis of the mid-1970s brought it all crashing down. Rising fuel costs forced airlines to cut back. Out went the extravagant lounges and gourmet meals. In came more seats and cost-cutting measures. The golden age of luxury flying was over, making way for a more practical, efficiency-driven industry. The journey of nearly 100 years of civil flights. From the shaky, wind-battered flights of the 1920s, carrying fewer than 20 passengers, to today's high-tech airliners with Wi-Fi, entertainment screens, and lie-flat seats, aviation has transformed dramatically. Each decade brought innovations, pressurized cabins, jumbo jets, and supersonic travel, shaping how we fly. While early air travel was a luxury for the elite, today, millions take to the skies daily, proving that the journey of flight is as remarkable as its destinations. The 1920s, the dawn of commercial air travel. The 1920s marked the birth of civil aviation, a time when flying was more of an adventure than a convenience. Airplanes of this era were small, typically carrying fewer than 20 passengers. Unlike today's high-flying jets, these early aircraft barely reached 100 meters in altitude and cruised at around 160 kilometers per hour, slower than some trains of the time. Flights were far from smooth. With limited technology, planes were constantly buffeted by the wind, shaking violently as they soared through the sky. The cabins were unpressurized, meaning passengers endured freezing temperatures and deafening engine noise. There were no flight attendants, no safety briefings, just a handful of daring individuals braving the elements for the novelty of air travel. Despite these challenges, aviation pressed forward. Airlines began experimenting with scheduled routes, and governments started investing in air infrastructure. While the experience was rough, the potential of air travel was undeniable. What started as a bumpy, uncomfortable ride in the 1920s laid the foundation for the golden age of aviation that would follow in the coming decades. The hidden danger of the golden age, when flying was riskier. People often romanticize the glamour of air travel in the 1950s and 60s, but one thing often gets overlooked. Flying back then was far more dangerous than it is today. In the United States alone, airlines suffered multiple fatal crashes every year, sometimes wiping out entire flights. Despite the luxury of spacious seating and fine dining, the reality was that stepping onto a plane carried real risk. Aircraft technology was still evolving, and pilots had to navigate unpredictable weather, unreliable instruments, and a lack of modern safety systems. Crashes were distressingly common, and for many passengers, flying wasn't just exciting, it was nerve-wracking. To ease these anxieties, airports prominently featured flight insurance kiosks. Travelers could take out a policy right before boarding, often just steps away from the gate, ensuring that their families would be compensated in case the worst happened. It was a stark reminder that air travel was not yet the routine, ultra-safe experience we take for granted today. While modern flights may lack the elegance of the past, Advancements in technology and safety regulations have made flying exponentially safer than it was during the so-called Golden Age. Skyjackers and security, when hijackings plagued the skies. Flying in the 1950s and 60s wasn't just more dangerous due to mechanical failures, it was also plagued by a wave of hijackings. By the mid-60s, hijacking a plane became so common that "Take Me to Cuba" turned into a running joke among comedians. Desperate individuals and political activists saw commercial airliners as easy targets, and security was so lax that hijackers could simply walk onto a plane with a weapon and demand a new destination. Then came one of the most infamous hijackings of all time, D.B. Cooper. In 1971, he boarded a Boeing 727, demanded $200,000 in cash, and then parachuted into the wilderness, vanishing without a trace. His bold escape made him something of a legend, but his crime also highlighted just how vulnerable air travel was at the time. These incidents eventually forced airlines and governments to take action. The security checkpoints we now endure might feel like a hassle, but they exist for a reason. Today, passengers can board a plane with the assurance that their flight is protected from the chaos that once made hijackings a terrifyingly routine occurrence. The swinging 60s and 70s, the rise of international air travel. By the 1960s and 70s, airlines weren't just selling flights, they were selling the world. International travel was no longer just for the elite. Airlines wanted everyone to dream of flying abroad. Leading the charge was Pan Am, a pioneer in overseas routes. Their ads made it sound effortless. 6.5 magic hours to Europe, New York to London in the same time as a baseball doubleheader. Suddenly, jetting across the Atlantic wasn't a distant fantasy, it was a reality. Other airlines joined in, eager to showcase the wonders of global travel. BOAC, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, painted vivid pictures of exotic destinations. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On the left-hand side, you can now see Victoria Falls. These flights weren't just about getting from point A to point B, they were an adventure, a gateway to the world. Airlines marketed international travel as a seamless experience, emphasizing that flight has conquered time. What once took weeks by ocean liner could now be done in hours. The jet age had arrived, and with it, the promise that the world was within reach. Whether you were sipping champagne over the Atlantic or marveling at the landscapes below. Do you think flying today is better or worse than in the past? Why? If you made it through the 1960s, you were tougher than you knew. Seatbelts were rare, smoking was everywhere, and danger was just part of daily life. Somehow, you survived, and probably had a blast doing it. It was a wild, unforgettable era that shaped a generation. What's your craziest 1960s memory? Drop it in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more nostalgic fun.